they thought no one could stop them. The mighty Ottoman Empire, armed with gunpowder, ships, and ambition, had swept across continents. But in the burning heart of East Africa, something unexpected happened. A fierce alliance of African warriors, local kingdoms, and untold courage brought their march to a standstill. This isn't just a forgotten chapter in history, ... It says the story of how Africa stood tall against one of the world's greatest empires. And it all started with one epic battle they never saw coming. The empire that challenged the world in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire, was not just powerful, it was unstoppable, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, and from the Balkans to the Red Sea. The Ottomans were masters of conquest, armed with elite janissaries, massive fleets, and cutting-edge artillery. They weren't just building an empire, they were shaping the world. But the Ottomans had bigger dreams. Their eyes turned south toward the Horn of Africa. Why? Because controlling East Africa meant controlling the trade routes of the Indian Ocean, tapping into the riches of gold, ivory, spices, and gaining strategic access to challenge Portuguese influence and dominate the Red Sea. To them, Ethiopia, the Christian empire nestled in the highlands, was just another domino to fall. But this would be no easy conquest. Standing in their path was a rugged landscape, unpredictable alliances, and a fierce people who had fought invaders before and won. The Ottomans thought they could walk in and take over, but East Africa had other plans. And as the empire moved closer, so did a storm they weren't prepared for. The rise of the African resistance as Ottoman ambitions pushed deeper into East Africa, they quickly learned this land wasn't like the others they had conquered. The mountains were unforgiving, the terrain treacherous, and the people unyielding. At the center of this resistance stood the ancient Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, ruled by Emperor Gelawdus, a young but determined monarch who carried the legacy of a proud civilization stretching back to the Aksumite Empire. But Ethiopia wasn't alone. Across the region, whispers of invasion stirred unlikely alliances. Muslim leaders, tribal warriors, and Christian nobles often divided began to unite under one urgent cause: defend their homeland from foreign domination. And then came the turning point, the rise of Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, also known as Ahmad Gragan. The left-handed, backed by Ottoman weapons and advisors, he launched a devastating jihad across Ethiopia, burning churches, toppling cities, and striking terror across the highlands. But instead of breaking Ethiopia, this fire forged something new. Emperor Gelawdus, battered but unbroken, regrouped in the mountains. Reinforcements arrived from Portugal's small in number, but armed with matchlocks and cannons. And for the first time, African Highlanders and European musketeers stood side by side, facing a common enemy. The Ottomans had expected a swift campaign. What they got was a full-blown resistance movement that was spiritual, political, and deeply personal. The stage was set. The invaders had brought their finest, but so had Africa. The battle that changed everything the year was 1543, the place Wayna Daga, a highland plain in northern Ethiopia. This was no ordinary battlefield, was where the fate of an empire would be tested. On one side stood Ahmad Gragan, the fearsome warlord backed by Ottoman muskets, cavalry, and a trail of conquests that left Ethiopia on the brink. His army was large, battle-hardened, and armed with the latest firearms provided by the Ottoman Surup's cutting-edge technology, now in the hands of an African war machine. On the other side stood Emperor Gelawdus, leading a coalition of Ethiopian warriors and a small but critical band of Portuguese musketeers, led by O da Gama, son of the legendary explorer Vasco da Gama. Though da Gama had been captured and executed earlier in the conflict, his legacy and his troops fought on. Their mission was clear: stop Ahmed Gragan at all costs. The battle was brutal. Swords clashed against steel, muskets cracked the air, and the cries of war echoed across the highlands. Gelidus himself led the charge, wielding his sword from horseback, rallying his troops in a display of raw courage. And then, in a moment that changed everything, Ahmed Gragan was killed in the chaos of battle, struck down by a Portuguese bullet. His death was like a thunderclap. Without their charismatic leader, Ahmad's army crumbled. Panic spread. Ottoman support faded. The tide had turned. This single battle didn't just save. Ethiopia sent a powerful message across the continent and beyond. The Ottoman Empire could be resisted. African unity, faith, and fierce determination had won against one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. It wasn't just a victory. It was a turning point.
Welcome to Decoding History and Science. Like, share, and subscribe. Press the bell icon for more. Comment your thought below.
The fall of Ottoman ambitions in East Africa, the death of Ahmed Gragan at Wayna Dagawazan, just a military lawsuit, shattered the Ottoman dream of dominating East Africa. In the wake of his fall, chaos rippled through his once powerful forces. The Ottoman-supported soldiers, many of whom were mercenaries and foreign fighters, lost their will to fight. The regional Muslim sultanates that had aligned with Ahmad quickly withdrew, trying to salvage what was left of their territories. The Ottomans, watching from afar, realized they had underestimated the resistance, the terrain, and the spirit of the people. Maintaining a military presence in such a rugged, hostile environment with few reliable allies and a crumbling coalition became not just difficult, but impossible. Their Red Sea ambitions began to shrink. Ethiopia, once scorched by war, began to rebuild. Churches were restored. Cities were revived. The victory at Wayna Daga became a symbol of survival, sovereignty, and strength. Emperor Gelidus emerged as a national hero, young, bold, and victorious against an empire that had crushed entire kingdoms. For the Ottomans, East Africa would never again be a primary target. They shifted focus back toward the Mediterranean and Arabia, retreating from a region that had proven too fierce and too unified to conquer. And so, what began as a campaign to control the trade routes of Africa ended in retreat and ruin. Ethiopia stood free. East Africa stood proud. And history took a very different path. Legacy of the battle and its global impact. The Battle of Wayna Daga was just a military victory. It became a powerful symbol of African resistance, national identity, and the limits of imperial power. For Ethiopia, it reinforced the nation's unique legacy as one of the only African civilizations to resist colonization for centuries. The battle carved Gelidus into history as a defender of faith and freedom, an emperor who stood his ground when the world thought all was lost. The partnership with the Portuguese, though brief, introduced new technologies and tactics that would influence Ethiopian warfare for generations. But the ripple effects didn't stop there. The Ottomans learned a painful lesson. Conquering East Africa wasn't worth the cost. Their defeat slowed their expansion into sub-Saharan Africa and changed their geopolitical priorities. They focused more on defending their empire in Europe and the Middle East, and less on controlling African trade routes from the south. For the Portuguese, it was a rare strategic win in their rivalry with the Ottomans. Their small force had helped tilt the balance in a much larger conflict. Proving the value of overseas alliances Alvanen in the most remote corners of the empire. Globally, the battle shattered the myth of invincibility surrounding both the Ottomans and European colonial forces. It showed the world that African kingdoms were not passive players in global history. They were fighters, diplomats, and survivors. Wayna Daga was a message across time. You can have cannons, fleets, and empires, but never underestimate the will of a people defending their land. The forgotten war in modern memory, despite its epic scale and global implications, the battle that halted the Ottoman advance in East Africa is rarely taught in schools or featured in mainstream history books. Why? Because history is often written by empires, and this was a war they'd rather forget. In Western narratives, the age of exploration often focuses on European voyages, colonial conquests, and battles in Europe and Asia. Africa, when mentioned, is usually portrayed as a passive land waiting to be discovered or colonized. The story of Wayna Daga shatters that myth. It shows us an Africa that was active, organized, and capable of standing toe-to-toe with global powers. Even in the Ottoman and Portuguese records, the war is mentioned only in fragments often downplayed or overshadowed by other campaigns. But in Ethiopia, the memory lives on. Songs, oral traditions, and ancient chronicles still celebrate Emperor Geladu's. The resilience of the people and the divine favor they believed helped secure their victory. Today, historians are revisiting these forgotten chapters, digging into ancient manuscripts, church records, and local lore to piece together what really happened. And what they're finding is clear. This was not a side story. It was a global clash of empires, faiths, and ambitions fought on African soil, and won by African courage. In a world still grappling with the legacy of empire and colonization, remembering battles like Wayna Daga isn't just about the past, it's about restoring truth, balance, and pride to the story of human history. Ethiopia's place in global power dynamics after the Battle of Wayna Daga. Ethiopia didn't just survive it, cemented its place as a sovereign powerhouse in a world dominated by empires. While much of Africa eventually fell under European colonial rule in the centuries to come, Ethiopia stood out. It was one of the only African nations that maintained its independence, thanks in large part to the foundation laid during this critical period of resistance. The victory over Ottoman-backed forces gave Ethiopia international recognition and a reputation as a kingdom that could not be easily subdued. European powers began to take Ethiopia seriously. Diplomats, missionaries, and explorers treated the Ethiopian emperors not as tribal chiefs, but as legitimate sovereigns of a proud Christian empire. Portugal's alliance with Ethiopia, although limited in scale, symbolized a rare moment in history where a European kingdom sought partnership, not domination, with an African state. But Ethiopia's resilience wasn't just political, it was spiritual and cultural. Amid the gunpowder and bloodshed, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church survived. Monasteries hidden in the highlands continued to produce ancient manuscripts. The Amharic language evolved, and a distinct national identity rooted in faith, freedom, and fierce independence began to crystallize. This moment in time gave Ethiopia a unique role in global power dynamics. It became a symbol of African sovereignty, a beacon for future independence movements, and a reminder that Africa had never been silent or powerless. And centuries later, when European empires tried once again to invade Ethiopia, would remember Wayna Daga. It would remember that empires fall, but those who fight for their land endure. Lessons for the modern world, the epic clash that unfolded in the highlands of East Africa. Nearly 500 years ago is more than just a historical footnote. Carries urgent lessons for today's world. First, resistance matters. In a time when global powers believed they could redraw maps and control people with sheer force, Ethiopia proved that determination, unity, and strategic alliances could overcome even the most powerful enemies. This echoes in every modern struggle for sovereignty, justice, and self-determination. Second, narrative matters. For centuries, stories of African resistance were buried, distorted, or forgotten. But the Battle of Wayna Daga reminds us that history is not just what happened, it's what gets remembered and who gets to tell it. In reviving stories like this, we're not rewriting history, we're restoring it. Third, it highlights the power of intercultural alliances. Ethiopia as temporary partnership with the Portuguese shows how vastly different cultures and religions can come together in the face of a common threat. In our increasingly polarized world, that lesson feels more relevant than ever. Finally, it reminds us that empires, no matter how vast or powerful, are not invincible. What truly endures is the will of the people, their connection to the land, and their commitment to defend their identity and future. In a modern era shaped by geopolitical struggles, power shifts, and cultural erasure, the forgotten war that halted the Ottoman advance in East Africa offers a message across the centuries. Never underestimate a people fighting for their home. Echoes of resistance. Why this forgotten battle still matters as we close the chapter on this powerful and nearly forgotten moment in history. Remember, this wasn't just a war over land, it was a war over identity, sovereignty, and the right of a people to shape their own destiny. The Battle of Wayna Daga was not just a military confrontation, it was a cultural and spiritual defiance. Ethiopia, standing alone against a rising Ottoman tide, didn't just defend its borders, it defended its faith, its history, its language, and its ancient heritage. And in doing so, it offered something rare and remarkable in the chronicles of empire: a different ending. It was a moment when an African kingdom refused to be absorbed into the machinery of empire. A moment when foreign ambition collided with local unity. And the world watched as the unstoppable Ottoman war machine came to a halt, not in Vienna, not in Europe, but in the highlands of East Africa. Think about that. Long before the scramble for Africa, long before modern maps were carved up by colonial rulers, there was an empire that tried and failed to bring Ethiopia to its knees. And because of that resistance, Ethiopia would go on to stand tall when the rest of the continent fell under foreign domination. It would become a beacon of African independence, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that history is not always written by the victors, but remembered by those who dared to resist. And yet, how many of us were ever taught this story? Why is it missing from textbooks? Why is it absent from films and documentaries? Why does the narrative of African power, agency, and resistance so often get erased? That's why telling this story now today is more important than ever. Because in a world that still struggles with the legacy of colonialism, still silences the voices of the marginalized, and still questions the strength of the oppressed, we need to remember Wayna Daga. We need to remember Geladus. We need to remember the Ethiopian Highlanders, the Portuguese musketeers, the priests, the farmers, the mothers, the elders, everyone who stood their ground when the world expected them to fall. This wasn't just a battle, it was a message. Empires rise, empires fall, but the spirit of resistance lives forever. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more ancient truths and scientific history. Watch next. Latest upload.